The Hebrew Torah is one of the most unique and thought-provoking collection of documents ever compiled. Join us on this quest to rediscover the lost world of the Torah. Today we are joined by Professor John Walton to discuss the ancient Near East and the biblical context.
And so to try to understand Torah, one of the difficulties is that in English, we tend to try to translate Torah by the word law, and that gives all the wrong impressions. Can't figure out what it should mean to us until we figure out what it meant to them, because it's not to us, but it is for us. There are legal texts from ancient Mesopotamia. The most well-known is the Hammurabi Stele, which is pictured on the right there, predated the time of Moses by hundreds of years. And yet they have some provisions that sound very much like some of the things that we have in the Torah, in our Bibles. Now that posed some difficulties, because those who were very skeptical of the Bible and didn't want to treat it as God's word, it gave them another excuse to say, see, this stuff existed long before. The Israelites just kind of copied that same stuff and said, oh, God gave it to us. Because if the Torah was given from Sinai and the Ten Commandments and these things, then how could have they already existed? Found in 1902, it was dubbed the Code of Hammurabi. That's already a tendentious, arguable label, because code implies a code of law. And so by labeling that, it already assumes that that's what this document holds. Turns out that's wrong, okay, but it still persists. Find out that it's not actual legislation at all. This is not legislation. There's no obligation that's carried in these provisions. They're formulated as case law. If somebody does this, then this is what you do. So it's formulated in casuistic case terms. And so they sought wisdom because in that wisdom they hoped to find order and understanding. Even today, of course, we talk about law and order, right? I mean, we get this. There was not justice in society. The people could not do what the gods needed them to do. In the Mesopotamian religious system was to take care of the needs of the gods. It didn't matter how you lived. Again, striking it was when Yahweh tells the Israelites, I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. So if I were hungry, I wouldn't ask you. He is not a God who has needs. And it throws the whole religious system of thinking out of whack. Likewise, the judges could look at these not to get what the ruling has to be, but rather wisdom to make a wise ruling. It's in the genre of list wisdom, and it's aspective. Now, that's not a word you use often, probably. Okay, what do I mean by that? Aspective means it gives certain aspects of the idea of justice. What is art? What is art, you know? And you start talking about what's art and what's not art, and Rembrandt comes up, and Picasso comes up, and Jackson Pollock, you say, oh, really? And by the time you're done, you find out that you can't define art. Yeah, you can't define art, but you can kind of put a lot of dots on the board of this is art, and this is art, and this is art, and this is art. You can draw a circle around the dots and say, that's art. See, that's aspective, different aspects of what could qualify as art. The book of Proverbs is the same thing. Nobody looks at the book of Proverbs and thinks that it's comprehensive. Every aspect of behavior to bring order and wisdom. It's aspective, different, these one-line proverbs all through it. And they describe. They do not prescribe. In other words, again, this is not legislation. Legislation would be prescriptive. Yet you ignore it at your peril. But we're not going to jump to a conclusion, right? Because this might be a similarity, but it might be a difference. So we can't assume that Israel will be the same. But if there are no examples of legislative action in the ancient world, and if the ancient world thought that way, then there's a high likelihood that Israel thought the same way, though recognizing that Yahweh is different from the gods of Babylon. And therefore, that might introduce some differences. But again, you always have to be willing to go with your evidence, see where it takes them. So we cannot assume labels such as legislation or moral system. Those are often presuppositions from our cultural river, because we read the word law. I'm just suggesting we can't start with that presupposition. Think of yourself out on the plains of Mount Sinai with the Israelites. You've just come out of Egypt, and there you are. The booming voice from heaven. You shall not kill. Really? We've never heard that before. What a glorious insight. We shouldn't just kill anybody we want. One of the problems when we make Torah a list of rules is that we are then inclined to check them off. Remember, the ruler who came to Jesus said, what do I have to do to get eternal life? Well, have you kept the law? I did this and this and this and this. Got my checklist. You want to see it? You know? And for Jesus, he would say, well, that's a good start. But then what does he tell him? But here's an idea. Go sell all that you've got. Didn't see that coming. It's the Pharisees that made it that. And that's not a model we want to follow. It's wisdom for order living in God's presence. Here's the difference. Here is the difference. There's a bigger issue. Holiness. Which does not exist in Mesopotamian thinking. There's no equivalent word. No equivalent concept. This, then, we have to understand what holiness is. We read in Leviticus 19:2, most of your translations say, "Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." Now, my son caught me on this one. His dad talked to me about that verb form. I said, "Oh, is it imperative?" You're translating it as imperative, be holy. Is it an imperative? I take a look at it, and I say, "Well, of course." Oh, no, it's not. What is it? It's an imperfect form, it's indicative. So how do you translate it? Come on, Dad. You are holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. That's a different thing. It's not something that you pursue. It's not something that you can lose. It's a status that is given, not an objective to be achieved. So you can see why I don't like to call it the law. The law gives every wrong implication. In the ancient world, taking a vassal enhanced the reputation of the suzerain. And so when God takes a vassal, Israel as his people, the idea is that his reputation should be enhanced. That's a very technical way of saying what the Bible calls a light to the nations. The Israelites didn't see it as law. They don't have such a thing in the ancient world. The Pharisees tried to make it law, preserving your status in the covenant. So Paul had to argue against it being law. How do we use the Torah if it's not our covenant and we're not in the ancient world? This gives me a guide to thinking about holiness and my responsibility and my identity and status that God has given me. Because everything that I do should enhance the reputation of the God that I serve in the covenant that I am in.
All right. What's up, everybody? Thank you for joining us today. So we have with us Dr. John Walton. Thank you so much for being here and taking the time. I know Dr. Walton is a busy guy, and so I really appreciate him taking the time to do this interview. I want to talk today about his book, The Lost World of the Torah. Very great book. I've got the Audible copy as well as a physical copy because I read it, and whenever I'm driving, I just can't read while I drive. So, Dr. Walton, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for inviting me on, William.
Yeah, no problem at all. I really appreciate it again. So to get started, I would say there is some overlap in this book about order, right, and chaos. And so we're doing this series whenever I'm bringing you on to talk about Genesis chapter 1, your Lost World book, as well as the Torah. I'm kind of going a little out of order with them, right? But they're in order for what I'm currently working on, what I'm, my personal context, which actually means a lot to what the book is about, the personal context or the situation that this wisdom that is your books, how they affect me and how I can use them in my context. So why don't you say a little bit about your book process? Like what is there some process to what order you're going in, and then talk about maybe the Lost World of the Torah a little more in detail.
Sure. The Lost World series works by laying out propositions and then defending those propositions. And by doing so, working logically through the material. It's not always easy or straightforward to arrange those propositions in the best way. And when I'm writing a Lost World book, I typically tinker with those things as I go along. And so in that sense, there are other ways that you could do the sequence of the material, but we try to find the one that will help people follow a track of thinking through the issues from the ancient world into the biblical text, and then finally into our own ways of thinking. So that's what's behind the method and typically how we go about writing it. Once we have the propositions, then we just start trying to address each one and give what information will be helpful.
And
You're right.
Specifically,
these books specifically, what?
Or this book specifically, The Lost World of the Torah. You want to give us like kind of a background? We've seen a little bit there in the clip, but do you want to say anything more about it?
Well, sure. It has to do with how we think about what this material is. I made a big point in that clip that you saw that we make a mistake to just start out with the assumption that it means law, legislation, a code. And it's understandable that we would have that idea in our minds because of the fact that so many English translations translate the word Torah as law. And that means that as moderns, we suddenly adopt all the baggage that comes with the word law in our modern context. And so I've made the point that Torah really isn't talking about law at all. It's really talking about the idea of wisdom and order. Wisdom is the pathway to order. And so if you want to achieve order, the highest value in the ancient world, then you need wisdom to do so. And we saw when we talked about Genesis 1 that that's about how God established order in the cosmos. The covenant is about God's initiative to bring about order on the human level. And so the covenant represents a relationship with God. It represents his intention to dwell among his people. And therefore, there is a social order that is essential to those things happening. Justice is part of that ordered world, but the larger issue is God giving Israel wisdom so that they will know how to conduct themselves in their covenant relationship with God, with him dwelling among them. And again, that's a long way from the concept of law, the way we think about it today. This is still just part of the whole idea that we've talked about of trying to read the text the way that the Israelite author and audience are reading it. And that means we have to try to get into their world.
Sure, that this works like right along with the things that I've been studying as well. When I had read Genesis 1, the Lost World of Genesis 1, I actually hadn't read the Lost World of the Torah. So picking it up and it's going right along with everything that I've been studying, but there are a lot of new insights that you give. And I feel like you give the best analogies as well. So I feel like that's why how you can explain it better. You have a much clearer cadence or method by which to explain these dense topics, because let's face it, there's a lot of people who they don't have the background knowledge that's necessary to understand many of these concepts, but you do a good job of that. You argue in the book that Torah should mean instruction, not like a legislative, legal, or moral text or word. I mean, so instruction, and you use examples like how Proverbs use the term Torah, right? Do you want to say a little bit about how we know from the usage in Proverbs that it doesn't mean what a lot of people take it to mean today?
Sure. Well, in Proverbs, of course, readers today easily recognize Proverbs as a book of wisdom. And we understand that all of the things that we find in the book of Proverbs are not laws. And certainly it's not comprehensive that every aspect of wisdom in every sphere of life is somehow covered by it. We recognize that, well, the term I used in the clip, it's aspective. It picks up various aspects of wisdom in your relationships with God, in your relationships in your community, your relationships with the king, relationships husband and wife, parents and children. It picks up various aspects from these areas of life and talks about how you can live in wisdom. And they become exemplary samples to try to help us understand the larger idea of wisdom for life that the book can't address all of. And so I find especially intriguing then that this book of wisdom, Proverbs, calls its instruction Torah. Clearly not legislation, clearly not anything that we would call law, but rather instruction for understanding. And so likewise, when we read in Deuteronomy that the Torah is intended to bring wisdom, the pieces fall into place, and we understand that we're dealing with wisdom literature of a different sort in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. It's still wisdom, it's not legislation. It's instruction, instruction on how God's people should conduct themselves in God's presence and in their covenant relationship.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of people will take so the word Torah, it's used it's used different ways in different contexts, right? The word law that we read commonly in our Bibles, we see it used in different ways. And skeptics will like in this book, The Composition of the Pentateuch by Dr. Joel Baden, he argues that like, well, the law was first just Deuteronomy, and then it was like, it encompassed more later on, and he makes this argument about that. We see Christ using the term law to quote Psalm 82. I I don't recall you talking specifically about that passage where Christ used Psalm 82 and says, "It says in your law." Is that related? How it seems the term law is expanded, or do you think it didn't develop? That law just always meant, instruction, and it never had any like it never had this attachment to Deuteronomy only.
I don't see any reason to attach the concept only to Deuteronomy, regardless of what processes of composition someone might conclude happened for the Pentateuch. Doesn't really make a difference in the concept that's represented there. The rituals of Leviticus are part of the covenant, and the various civil laws that we see, the ways they dress, the ways they wear their hair, all of these issues are part of what they perceive to be the world of order. And Torah is a way to talk about this order that they are going to represent. So in that sense, the composition theories don't really matter to me and don't make a difference on this issue.
Okay.
It might make a difference in terms of what ideas did the Israelites have at what time periods. But that's difficult to sort out. And even if we could, that's still only what happens to be represented in the literature. That doesn't mean that that's all that was represented in the way that they thought about the world and their covenant relationship with God. So I'm not overly concerned about that issue. By the time we get to Jesus, of course, some developments have taken place, both within the Hellenistic and Greco-Roman world, as well as within the Jewish population and how they viewed the Torah. And so we get a taste of that in the Pharisees and the ways they were talking about the Torah, which of course in the Greek text is nomos. And so some things have changed by then. It's still not a fully legislative system like we have developing centuries later, but it's moving along that spectrum, that continuum, that will eventually lead to that development. But still, there are changes that took place in Hellenism that lead into the New Testament.
Sure. And I found that actually seemed like it coincided when I was thinking about this wisdom literature, instruction, Torah, and the way that Christ uses the term law there for the Psalms. And I was like, well, that kind of coincides if you look at that as the same thing as Torah there. Another point a point you made about the Proverbs in the book is you said, and this directly relates to apologetics. You said you often get a few phrases like, here's this, and then the next line will almost just be like the exact opposite. You give the example of answer a fool according to his folly, right? There's two instructions there. There's one that you shouldn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lest he be wise in his own eyes, and then the next line is that you should answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes, right? And so with that, in the apologetics world, we have like the presuppositionalists who will say, look, we shouldn't let them question God and put God on the stand, and they're the judge, right? That's answering a fool according to his folly. But then the evidential side will say, well, no, look at the next verse, right? It says you should. And you're pointing out rightly here that that's the point, is that wisdom literature isn't, here's the law, follow that in all times, in all situations, universally, or else you're doing something immoral. It's saying, here's a good concept. Here's another good concept. And depending on what you're doing and where you're at and all these things, one of these concepts is really wise to do. So would you want to explain that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, true wisdom requires attention to the circumstances, and circumstances can make a difference. In English, we say, look before you leap. We say, well, that's true. That's really a good word, and I should be cautious about jumping into things, else it may be premature. I might make a mistake. So look before you leap. Then you turn around and somebody says, he who hesitates is lost. You say, okay, well, I get that. That makes some sense. You've got to seize the day. You've got to grasp the opportunities. And so if you hesitate, you may lose that opportunity. But then there you are stuck. If I look before I leap, then I'm hesitating and I'm lost. If I hesitate, if I don't hesitate, well, then I'm jumping into something. Which one do I do? And of course, neither of those are supposed to address every situation. Rather, they give perspectives that you may have to consider as you think about your decision-making process. And sometimes you'll want to be cautious and wait. Other times you want to step forward and seize the day. The same thing happens even in the biblical narratives. When Abraham and Sarah are trying to figure out what in the world to do because of the fact that they don't have children. In chapter 15, Abram is told that the son will come from him. It won't be his servant. It'll be his very biological child. But that doesn't say anything about Sarah. And so in chapter 16, you get them sitting there and saying, what are we supposed to do? We've been waiting all this time. Sarah's barren. She's postmenopausal, and the chances don't look very good. Are we supposed to still continue waiting in faith? Looking before you leap, pausing, waiting, patient, okay? Or does God expect us to kind of step out in faith, right? You can wait in faith, or you can step out in faith. Does God want us to step out in faith and kind of forge our own path? And that's the Hagar solution, of course, in chapter 16. At this point, they're left without complete information. They're trying to make the best call they can make. And God hasn't really explained to them whether they're supposed to be patiently waiting in faith or stepping out in faith. And so they give it a shot. Of course, in chapter 17, we find out that God tells Abram, oh, no, it's not going to be Ishmael. Actually, Sarah is going to have a child, which stuns him. For 13 years, he's figured the promised child is Ishmael. This promise has been fulfilled. The covenant's moving forward. Ishmael, Ishmael, Ishmael. And then after 13 years, God says, no. So what constitutes wisdom? What constitutes faith? Waiting or stepping out? And it's not always a clear-cut decision to be made. And so that's why we ask for wisdom, because wisdom can only be pursued by wise people assessing wise words. And sometimes circumstances make a difference.
And that's your point in the book, is if you were to look at these multiple options and say, well, these are supposed to be law, right? These are supposed to be like, it's written here, it is written, so it's got to be, that's got to be the option. But then you get another one, then it's like, oh, hang on a second, what's going on here? So that it just makes sense on the view. So I like how you use the analogy of cultural river, and it especially means a lot to me because when I was talking to my friend, Dr. David Falk, about his book on Egypt and the Ark of the Covenant, these types of things. In the book, he talks a lot about the ancient barks. And I was unfamiliar with this bark boat
thing, right? I mean, I had seen the like boats before, but and I had heard the terminology, but I'm like, what is going on with this? Why would they want a boat for their God, right? And then he says, like, well, think about it. If you grew up around the Nile or around rivers all the time, where you boats were the way to travel. If you don't have the wheel and things like this, you go by boat, and so it makes sense in light of their cultural context. And you give a ton of good analogies of this in the book, and one that I appreciate. So actually, I came up with one of my own I was thinking about, and I was thinking about how we look at the text from our perspective. I like to call, like, people who call themselves fundamentalists, a lot of time I call them Western fundamentalists, because they'll take on the traditions that came to us through the Western world and not necessarily what the Hebrew author meant. Sometimes, not all the time. But I heard somebody say, left to their own devices, they would get nothing done. And I could just see somebody digging up a manuscript from recent times and say, well, left to their own devices, well, they had cellular devices and computers and these other types of devices. So left to their devices, they'll get nothing done because there's so much to do on them. But back in the 70s, if that phrase would have been said, the phrase didn't originate talking about devices as in like electronic devices. So when we read some of these things, we're reading in what we believe into the text, and you warn against that in the book.
Yes, very much so. It's since our own cultural river, and that's everything. That's our values, our politics, our religion, our economics, our science, our all of these things that kind of frame how people think in our world. Globalism, consumerism, whatever it might be, individualism, all of those things are part of our cultural river. And since they are, whether we like those things or not, they're part of our cultural river. And that's the easiest way for us to think. To think a different way is very challenging and very difficult. And we wouldn't know necessarily how to think like somebody else, even in our own world. You encounter people from other cultures, we realize how difficult it is to think the way they think about any variety of things. And so that's the cultural river idea. And when we read the Bible, our inclination is to read it in light of our cultural river, which means that we're imposing something foreign on the biblical text. We are foreign. We're outsiders. We're not insiders. We're not Israelites, neither author nor audience. And so we're outsiders. And yet their communication is between insiders. And that's how God worked it. It was God's choice to have Israelites communicating to Israelites. And so we're outsiders. They're communicating insider. And it's very difficult for an outsider to fully penetrate insider communication. We don't know their cultural river. And it would be anachronistic, an imposition to push our cultural river onto these texts. And so when we read the Bible intuitively, we're reading it through our cultural river. And that means that our intuition is not reliable because it does not reflect what the biblical authors were saying or thinking or communicating. And if it's not in line with what they are saying, then where's the authority? The authority comes in their intentions because God did it that way. God vested his authority in them, and his message is communicated through their message. And so we have to make every attempt to be accountable to those authors and their intentions, simply because that's how God worked. If we bypass that and do our own thing, we don't have authority. We're without authority.
Yeah, I see this a lot. Last time when we talked about Genesis, you see people doing this where they'll be talking about stretching out the heavens and they go, see, Big Bang cosmology. And it's like, well, they didn't know anything about material causes or anything like that. And so, I mean, it just makes sense that we don't need to read into eisegesis, right? One of the analogies that so this is something that that I was unfamiliar with, or at least I was looking at it the wrong way. And one of your analogies really helped me. So you make a point in the book that when God talks about blessings and curses in relationship to his covenant with Israel, it's not like, hey, I just want to hang out with you guys, and if you're breaking a universal objective law, I'll have no choice but to curse you. But it's rather like God is saying, listen, I'm about to bring about my will either way. Okay. I'll make a covenant with you. And if you can represent me before the nations, be a light unto them. And in that scenario, I'll bring about my will and you'll have blessings because I'm there to protect you and to guide you. But on the other hand, if you fall into, chaos, don't heed the wisdom, right? Then I'm going to bring about my will through you being conquered and dispersed throughout the nations. And it doesn't matter. I can bring about my will either way. So, and you use a doctor analogy where you say, the doctor doesn't like say, hey, take this treatment for your cancer or else I'll give you I'll give you a heart attack, right? You don't get cursed for that. He's just saying, look, take this or else you're going to have a problem. So if you take this, you'll be blessed because you'll be getting better. If you don't take it, it's your choice, but you're not going to be doing well.
Now, that was my son's analogy that he came up with and contributed to the book. He's very good at coming up with those kinds of illustrations and analogies. And it just helps us think through the issues, to kind of see them in different light. So much of what we find in the Torah reflects the idea that Yahweh, their God, is also Yahweh, their King. And we don't really engage the text on that level because kingship is kind of something not part of our experience and not something that we generally approve of. And so we kind of think it is theologically Yahweh is their God. But so much of the exclusivism, so much of the covenant structure, so much of the Torah is really based on the kingship of Yahweh. Yes, he is their God, but he is their king. And that's something that we so often miss. And so when we look at the blessings and curses that you were talking about, those come with international treaties, and they deal with how kings interact with their vassals. And we can understand that a whole lot more if we understand that premise of kingship. And that's also something that my son brought to the table as we wrote the book together, because he really saw that clearly and helped me to see it more clearly.
Yeah, so you talk about Paul and Paul's understanding of the law and how we don't need to think of Paul as having the exact same frame of reference as an ancient Israelite, but that Paul, he was using the law to, in his context. And you talk about how Paul kind of argues against the way the Pharisees and others are using the law. Would you say that? So here's what I get this from people all the time. Last time I had you on, I mentioned it briefly, but people are going to say, oh, can we really, so you're saying I need to have all this knowledge of history to understand it. And you address this in the book. But what do you say to that person who says, hey, look, how can I, as somebody who doesn't read a lot of books, I work a lot or whatever, how you're saying I can't just open the Bible and read it straight off the page?
What I'm saying is that there are dangers to doing that because we are automatically reading into the Bible things that don't belong there because they're part of our culture. Somebody will say, well, I don't read a whole lot. I don't know a whole lot. I'm just kind of floating along here. But look at what you're doing. You're making a boatload of assumptions about what this is. You're concluding that it's law. You're concluding that it's legislation. You're concluding that it's rules. You're concluding all sorts of things that you have been told or you read or you heard or whatever it might be. And one of the main things that I emphasize is you've got to recognize that element and try to move those things off your table of givens, of assumptions, and move those to the side. And that'll allow you to ask a different set of questions. Now, whether you can answer that different set of questions is another matter, but at least then you won't be imposing potentially false assumptions on the text by assuming it's law. So we might claim to be unknowledgeable, but the knowledge that we have, however we got it, however formal or informal, is stuff that we use that influences how we read text. And one of my main arguments is recognize that stuff and move it out of the way. And that'll at least give you a chance to look at the text with fresh eyes.
Sure, yeah. Speaking of fresh eyes, you mentioned in Proposition 17 that Christians a lot of times have this meta narrative. They're using the wrong meta narrative, basically. And so if you use this false meta narrative that the law was trying to intend this, and then you're reading the rest of the text, you say that you're going to end up reading into the text something that it was never intended. And so we have to kind of start with this correct meta narrative of what was actually intended. And so with that, if we look at the law, would you say that the majority of Christians that you've ever spoke to say that they think this thing about like the law are these like principles that you should never break, you should never intentionally do the opposite of? Like you mentioned a lot of the different examples in the book, tattoos, and different things like this, wearing mixed fabrics, your fringes of your shirt. Would you say that's, to me, that seems like the most common understanding. But after reading the book and some other people's work as well, I wonder, like, was it just the Western tradition? I know you mentioned the reformers in the book as well, and you say that kind of like, look, if they had all this evidence, they'd look at it too. So what do you think about that whole issue of like most people's view on it? Is it just the Western view, or is it, because of the Reformation, or what do you think?
Well, I think lots of people will, because they see the word law in their translations, they will think about it as law, and they know that law is something they're supposed to submit to and to obey. And therefore, they would kind of take that position that the Bible has God's law, and this is God's law, and God doesn't change, so his law doesn't change. And so these are things that we're supposed to do. Now, they might say that, but at the same time, they struggle with precisely some of the passages that you mentioned. They know that we don't wear tassels on our garments. They know that we don't kind of resist shaving our side curls. They know these things. And so they try to find ways to disinclude that material. Some logic, some reasoning, because law is something we should obey, yet we're not obeying this. So why shouldn't we? And why is the other stuff different? And so we go through all these gymnastics. And I talk about that categorization that sometimes takes place of moral law and civil law and ritual law. And those are gymnastics. And so in that sense, all of that problem comes because people have made the assumption that they're dealing with law. And of course, that's one of the main things that we try to unpack in the book, that we shouldn't think of it in those terms. But yes, lots of Christians say, well, of course we're supposed to obey God's law. But again, they haven't thought through it all with the problems that such an approach creates.
Sure. So in Proposition 6, it's the Israelite covenant effectively functions as an ancient Near Eastern suzerainty treatment. So it seems obvious from the text that this is the case, right? We get classic suzerainty motifs. The language is there. I have this view that, and I think you mentioned like the wedding language a little bit in the book, but I've been like really like compiling all the wedding language with God and Israel and Christ and the church, of like the bridegroom and the bride, and and all these things. Is this kind of the same concept that we can think of as like the suzerainty treatment, the or treaty, the bride and the bridegroom?
In the ancient world, there would have been similarities between the two because marriage in the ancient world was an alliance of tribes. And sometimes it was on a parity level, that is, they're both equal parties. But other times, certainly one party may have had some higher status than another party. It's always a beneficial thing, they would think, to marry up and improve your status. So there's a lot of similarity because these represent relationships between clans. That's on the marriage level. In the suzerain treaties, they represent relationships between nations or ethnic groups, between kings. But it's still the idea of a relationship that has conditions and stipulations that are expected to be observed. And so that idea that a relationship is established through these mutual expectations. So certainly those two scenarios, marriage and international treaties, can be compared because they have some similarity in terms of what they represent. And God making a covenant with Israel is in that same category because it's establishing a relationship between two parties that has certain expectations of how the two will respond to one another and what's involved in the relationship that they have.
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot also about adoption, and it seems to me the language that's used a lot of times with servants, even though they don't outright say adoption, a lot of times it seems like there's this adoption like motif, like with Ruth, for example, right? If you look at like what Boaz says after her mother-in-law, she marries into the family, her husband dies, her mother-in-law's headed back to Israel, and she says, "Go back to the land of your mothers and your forefathers." And Ruth's like, "No, I don't want to." And she's like, "Go back, honestly, like your sister did." And she calls the other Moabite that married in your sister and her daughters, of course. And then Ruth says something like, "No, I will go to your land with you. Your fathers will be my fathers. Your God will be my God." And then when Boaz talks to her for the first time, he says something that's so odd, something like, "I've heard about what you've done, about how you have been taken under the wings of our God," or something like that, right? And so he really treats her well. And so I don't know, it just seems like kind of like adoption language almost into the Israelite clan. Am I reading into that? Or?
I mean, adoption has similar principles behind it. That is, it's the establishment of a formal relationship, and that changes one's status. It contributes to one's identity, and there are sort of ways of acting that define that relationship. So in that sense, adoption, marriage, they're both legal actions, just like an international treaty. Legal actions establishing new relationships with their responsibilities between them.
Yeah, so in, let's see, Proposition 8, you say Near Eastern rituals serve to meet the needs of the gods. And you talk about this, you talk about how, like, in the ancient Near East, it didn't seem as if, or there weren't these rules on how you live life, and if you do such and such, you're immoral. It was more about the utility of, let's say, the gods, appeasing the gods, because if not, they may leave you, or they may curse you, things like this. Do you think that that's tied more to the sense in humans for survival, so that they're doing these things for these gods because they want to survive as a people and they don't really care about what's moral or immoral? It's just more about making it so we can survive. Whereas you, as you say, there's a huge difference with the Israelite God.
Uh, People always work with this big question: what do the gods want? Of course, some people conclude there are no gods, and then they've got other things going on. But what do the gods want? They're more powerful than we are, so we'd better try to make sure to make them happy. Uh, So in the ancient world, they decided that the gods want something very similar to what human rulers want. They want to be respected. They want to be cared for. They want to be pampered. They want to be fed. They want to be housed. They want to be clothed. They want to be amused. They want things that will work to their own benefit and meet their needs. And people in the ancient world had come to the conclusion that the gods were the same way, that the gods had needs, food, clothing, housing, etc. The gods had wants, and furthermore, that they had created people to meet those needs. That was the very purpose people were created in the ancient world. So when people recognize their role and status, subservient to the gods, created to meet the gods' needs, then of course they say, what do the gods want? They want their needs to be met. And so the rituals and the temples and the priests and all of those things are part of meeting the gods' needs. Moral behavior is not in that list. The gods don't need their behavior. The gods appreciate justice in society because when there's justice, there is order. And when there is order, people can go about meeting the needs of the gods. Justice isn't inherently valued. It's secondarily valued as a way to order, and order is a scenario in which the gods will have their needs met. And of course, this is where Israel is very, very different from the world around them, because Yahweh makes it pretty clear, I don't have needs, and I didn't create you to meet my needs. And the temple is not housing that I need, and the sacrifices aren't ritual that I need. And justice is something that's very much more important to me. And so in that sense, there's a whole different set of expectations that are involved. The term I give for this system of mutual needs being met is, I call it the great symbiosis, because this is gods and humans living together, mutual dependence, mutual needs, and the system works to sustain both parties. In the Bible, the great symbiosis is utterly shattered because God doesn't have needs, and he didn't create people for that purpose. He created people to work alongside of him to bring order in the world. And that's the job that people have. And that order they bring in the world includes justice, mercy, walking humbly with your God, we're back to Micah 6. And so in that sense, the whole way that Israel viewed rituals, even though the rituals looked very much the same on the surface to what a Babylonian or an Egyptian might do, the rituals had a totally different purpose behind them because they were not meeting the needs of the gods.
Yeah, okay, Walton, right? But so I'm being adversarial. Okay, Walton, with your fancy books and all, but it specifically says Yahweh commanded this. So obviously that means that this isn't something that they derived, right? This is something that was shot down from outer space. What do you say to something like that?
Well, certainly Yahweh is seen as the one who has given the Torah. And in that sense, they derive from him. That doesn't mean that he's making them all up new and Israel's never heard of them before. We know that's not true. We know that there are lots of things in the Torah that are very similar to what people all around them are doing. So when Yahweh comes, I mentioned this, I think, in the clip you showed, when Yahweh comes and says you shouldn't murder, that's not new information. That's not revelation to them. That's not something that shattered their world of thinking differently. So we have to ask, what is that doing? It's coming from Yahweh. So what's the point? And I think there we have to proceed to a different level of thinking, not just thinking in terms of civil or moral order. This is how you ought to behave ethically, but rather to understand how God is portraying himself in the covenant. Again, Israel is a light to the nations. That means they're showing what it's like to have a different sort of God, a different sort of relationship to God. And well, what does that look like? And it doesn't mean that they're going to overthrow all of the good sensibilities that anybody would have and say, oh, we serve our God and we can murder anytime we want. Well, no. But now the prohibition of murdering is not because this is a necessary law. It's because you are holy as I am holy, and therefore you need to present me to the world in a certain way. And some of that is by following along with the good sensibilities that the world around you has. But they still come from God as the stipulations of the covenant, that this is part of covenant behavior. So this is not saying these are human rather than divine, but it does insist that we have to think about what is divine about them. What's the revelation? What's the authoritative message?
Yeah, so let me ask you this, because I think you make a good case in the book that we don't need to look at these other cultures and go, look how far more updated the Bible is. Look how it's much closer to our modern sensibilities and morality, right? You argue that that's not a good move because that's not what the authors were, for the most part, staying with the normal culture that they were in. But couldn't you say that there are certain developments in the text that does seem to indicate that it is better, at least more humane in a lot of places, and that there are some places where God does say, like, look, do this because I am the Lord your God. I remember when you were in this situation, for example, Leviticus chapter 25. A lot of atheists online like to bring that up as some like terrible verse because it says, that you can have foreign slaves or servants, right? But to the ancient Near East scholars, they're like, well, this is one of the best developments like toward humanity that exist. And so it's so interesting to see both sides and see one side saying, oh, it's saying that you can have slaves, and the other side saying, no, it's outlawing just slaves among citizens and things like. What do you think about the whole updating process?
Well, there are certainly places where we might draw the conclusion that what we have in the Torah reflects more humane practice than what we might find in Hammurabi, for instance. But of course, maybe other cultures that we don't have their literature from were just as humane. We can't just compare to Hammurabi and make the decision there. So we really don't know whether Israel is being more humane than everyone around them, or they just happen to have a different thing than Hammurabi has at that moment. Furthermore, there are things in Hammurabi that could strike us and our sensibilities as more humane than what we find in the Bible. So we can't make this sort of a test case, and we only take the ones that work in our favor, and we ignore the others. The idea that the Bible is a moral upgrade cannot be substantiated either in the comparative work or in the very concept of what Torah is, because Torah does not present a moral system, though what it does present may have moral implications. But it is not a moral system, and therefore to look at it as a moral upgrade just doesn't have the information, the support, either inside the Bible or outside of it, to substantiate it.
Yeah, so maybe just another couple questions, and then we'll get to questions from the audience. So you talk about the Torah cannot provide proof texting to solve today's issues. It's in Proposition 20. And so I mentioned this in a recent debate I had. where I said, like, hey, I think it's a bad move for Christians to say, this is a law for all time that we should follow. And so there are many things in the law that are good, and then there are, like you said, many things that we would question today for our time, because this goes right along with what we were just saying. Because again, like you mentioned, Hammurabi, um, one thing, the classic example is that the servitude is only 3-year terms instead of 7-year terms or 6-year terms. So that, I mean, that would be an example of potentially a better, more humane treatment. But it wouldn't matter, because what you're arguing in the book is that this isn't trying to be once and for all universal moral law, but rather it's just a wisdom. It worked for them, and it was good for them in their time. And so when you look at proof texting issues from like people who do try to say this, right? You want to explain a little bit about the issue with proof texting, some of these things?
Sure. Again, proof texting in general, whether it's Torah or anything else, has the difficulty that it often is neglectful of the context, not just the cultural context, perhaps the linguistic context, perhaps the literary context. Proof texting pulls something out of its context, and context is everything. So to that extent, we have to be respectful of context if we're going to respect the authority of the biblical text. Authors in the Bible are using a verse not just by itself, but in the context of other verses. And therefore, if we're going to respect their authority, we have to respect context. So that's one issue with proof texting in general. With proof texting from the law, the problem that arises, besides that general one, is that often we are so selective. We grab the ones we like. We ignore the ones we don't like. And if we don't have a consistent hermeneutic, we are not going to be able to have consistent biblical conclusions that reflect the authority of the text. And so that becomes the problem. You're just grabbing the things that you like at random from a larger collection that you don't follow. And how then, who's making that choice? Is it the author? No, it's you. And you don't have authority. I don't have authority. The author does.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book that a lot of times what people like to do is they want to find something to back their view. And so they search all through the Bible, and the scriptures say something like, you search the scriptures to show that you have eternal life or something, right? And I noticed this a lot with people's understanding, but I wonder, it seems so clear that when you read the words of like Christ, when he says like, you've heard this, but I say this, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but, turn the other cheek, or Moses gave you that law because of the hardness of your heart, or all these different things that seem to, like the Sabbath, don't let people judge you on the Sabbath, food laws and different things where it's turned over. And you and I've heard Dr. Heiser as well kind of contextualize the mixed fabrics thing. It's that the priest wore mixed fabrics, and so it was kind of like wearing a cop's uniform. And some of these things that we look at and go like, what? But you say that, well, it's funny how people will pick the things they want, but then mixed fabrics, they'll just be like, psh. Or like one I always think of is, a pastor being like, everything in the Old Testament is done away with except for tithing. It's like some of these things were kind of motivated reasoning. And one I hear a lot from non-believers is, and this will be my last question, and we'll move to questions from the audience, is I hear a lot from non-believers that, what do you mean? Jesus specifically said, I didn't come to abolish the law. And he says, until heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or tittle from the law will pass. See, they read parts of it, right? They don't read the whole thing about it being fulfilled and all. So, what do you think about that, specifically, that use of that verse?
Well, again, you have to understand that Jesus, even though The text uses the word nomos. We don't know that Jesus was speaking Greek. He probably was speaking Aramaic, from what I understand. I'm not a specialist in New Testament, but he's referring to the Hebrew Torah, whatever language he's using to refer to it. And as he refers to the Hebrew Torah, again, he's not talking about it as law. It's not legislation. And so he's not talking about the change of legal systems or something of that sort. What would it mean to fulfill the Torah? What would it mean to carry it out? If the Torah is God's instruction for helping Israel to have wisdom, to live in a covenant relationship with him, of course Jesus is not getting rid of that. He's going to show them how to do that even better. And that's the kind of statements that he makes. So we have to understand how, the actual terms that Jesus is using and how that affects our understanding of his statements.
Right. Yeah. So it seems so obvious to me that if you read part of the verse, it's just like, oh, I didn't come to, abolish the law. Not one jot or tittle will pass. But it's like he said, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And then he says, not one jot or tittle will pass from the law until all be fulfilled or accomplished. So it's like, that's exactly what he came to do. But it's not that he's getting rid of it. It's that he's completing it by what somebody just said in the chat, hang all the laws and the prophets on these two. So let's get to some questions here. One was kind of already what I asked you about the layperson understanding some of these things. But we have a question. Historically, when did the accommodationist understanding of looking at scripture begin, in the last century or earlier?
I'm wondering what the questioner means by the accommodationist perspective. Do you mean looking at the text in light of the ancient world? Do you think that's what is the question?
Yeah, maybe you can clarify, Slam, in the chat below, and I'll ask another question until we hear back from you. So let's just move to the next question. A certain group of people who are oppose the stuff Walton says. They claim if people like Walton are right, then the Bible is not special or of God. What do you think of this?
I think that totally misrepresents what I say. In every line you hear me talk, I understand it as the word of God. But God communicates into culture. He uses their language, he uses their culture, and God is the source of scripture. So I don't know how anyone would conclude that I think that this is somehow not God's word and it's just a human word. Everything about the authority of the scripture that I say, that's based on the author's intentions because God gave them those intentions, that's all premised on the idea that this is God's word. So I think that is not a good reflection of my methodology.
Yeah, and you do specifically say that, like, well, look at the other cultures. They were just trying to appease their gods, but God, he said, I don't need you. So you are saying that there is something special about the text.
But the Israelites are part of an ancient world, and therefore, by nature, by cultural river, they thought more like Babylonians than they think like us. That would be so transparently true. God certainly tried to change some of the ways they thought, but there's an awful lot of what they thought in their world that he had no reason to change and that he didn't change. And therefore, we're not surprised that in some ways they're thinking like Babylonians or Egyptians. And that's not problematic to them. God is being very specific about the things that he is getting them to change, like the great symbiosis, like the covenant relationship. Those are places they're supposed to change. But there's so much else that they're embedded in their world and they think like people around them, not like us.
Yeah, I was just thinking about it, John. I really like your story. I like the way you tell your story because it seems so. It seems so. It doesn't seem contrived. When you tell your story, when people say, who are you? What do you say, well, I grew up in a Christian household. We read the Bible, and I find it that a lot of people seem to want to say that, like, well, yeah, I was an atheist and now I'm not. Now I'm, but it's almost like they need to seem more rational, or like, yeah, I had your view before. And once I've heard that story so many times, I'm starting to think, like, man, is there any Christians that grew up Christian and they're not? Because we get the same thing about, oh, so you grew up in the religion that your parents taught you and things like this. For you, it seems like you're just like, I love the way you're just like, you're immune to that. You're just like, no, I grew up in a Christian household. We read the Bible, good family, things like this. So I love that about you. Is there anything you want to say on that specific point, or you?
Well, again, in that sense, the way I grew up has a lot to do with how I think. And I think in light of how I was raised. And that's true of most of us, even if we end up saying, no, I don't believe whatever anymore, or my parents were atheists and I've decided to be a person of faith. I mean, even when we make those choices, there's still an awful lot in our makeup, in our identity that is tied to our roots. And that's the same with Israel as a nation. They're tied to their roots in the world in which they lived. They can't think like a 21st century person would think. They were years away from having the internet. Ha ha. Okay, so that we have to be careful what we attribute to them.
Yeah. So here's a question that came in that you do talk about in the book. Do you think the modern concept of eternal conscious torment, or hell, is in the scriptures, New or Old Testament? And you actually do talk about this prospect for the ancient Israelite.
Yeah, it's not in the Old Testament. The closest you could get to it is in Isaiah 66:24, and that certainly doesn't give a clearer view of conscious eternal punishment. The Israelites had no concept of either reward or judgment in the afterlife. And so they're not thinking those things. And so we have to recognize again that that's something that God did not reveal to them. And therefore, they think an awful lot like Babylonians do. Their default is in the ancient world. If God changes that default, that's great. But lots of the defaults he didn't change, and that's one of them.
Correct. And so just to wrap up here, we have, they might have had this concept of the underworld, right? Would you say?
Netherworld, sure. But everybody goes there, and there's no reward or judgment there.
Okay, great. So, John, I really appreciate you. I want to just check the chat here and make sure there's not any other questions.
Did the one with the accommodationist come back?
It came in. Yep. So, yes, that is what I meant by accommodationist. So they said yes to your
Well,
point.
you can't start trying to read the Old Testament against the ancient world until you have some resources that show you the ancient world. And those resources only became available to us in the last 100+ years as archaeology brought forth all of these texts that we benefit from. So you can't really think that way very well until you have that material. So in that sense, it's fairly new. On the other hand, even before that material was available, certainly interpreters of earlier ages would have loved to have a deeper understanding of the cultural context in the Old Testament, but they didn't have it. They could long for it. They could try to get whatever they could. So, for instance, in early Christianity, they made frequent reference to the Babylonian Hellenistic priest Berosus, who was the only source that they had for ancient Babylonia. He was already Hellenistic. He wasn't thinking like an ancient Babylonian, but it was the closest they had. And all we have of Berosus is what the early Christian writers preserved for us because they were so interested in that. So they were trying to do it to the best of their ability, but they simply didn't have the resources. And the resources have been developed in the last century plus as the cuneiform texts have been unearthed, as the languages have been deciphered, as the texts have been translated, and as we now are able to do synthesis and kind of understanding the big picture that we find there.
Yeah, so in the grammatical historical method has been a staple of Christianity. I mean, it's it doesn't seem at all to be far fetched to go with, look at the historical evidence. And then one thing that Dr. McGregor mentioned when he was on was somebody was accusing him of philosophy. He made this great point where he's like, if it's true, isn't all truth God's truth? Like, why would we, be? And I noticed this myself when I was younger and more fundamentalist. Is when I began to listen, like years ago, I listened to this old lecture series that was on YouTube by Dr. Christine Hayes, and when she started talking about the Suzerain, treaties and all these different sources and different things, it really alarmed me. Like you know, it worried me, and so I didn't watch it again for years. But then, whenever I finally started getting in, learning about real scholars in the Christian world, and not just like apologists with a PhD, but just like people who actually really contend with these ancient sources and so forth. Then I started saying, oh, now I can see how they piece together, and that really helped me in in my quest with this. But you can see how someone might be afraid of these ancient works, like they pose some threat.
I understand that. The the approach has to be then to take a careful look at your methodology, because if your methodology is honed and fine-tuned, you can see how that information can be beneficial and not threatening. And so it really takes the careful attention to methodology. And that's why I start each of the Lost World books with a discussion of methodology, our accountability to the author's intentions, language, culture, literature, our accountability, because that's where the authority is. And if you can get your methodology in place, you will find that this information is not so threatening.
Yeah, I really found that for myself as well. And so I say, hey, there are answers to these questions. And like I said before, if it's true, it's God's truth, right? Everything that's true is God's truth. Uh, I sorry, I have one last thing to come in real quick, and we'll end on this note. Spartan says, "Who's the school that has most influenced Dr. Walton?" And he clarifies scholar. I see. Who's the scholar that has most influenced Dr. Walton in his career?
That would be difficult to say because, as you can see in the wall behind me, there's just unending literature. A good 3 or 4 of those cases are all filled with ancient Near Eastern literature information. And so it's something that I've developed in collaboration with other people who are thinking this way, but I can't really point to one scholar who has made the most impact on me.
Okay, that's understandable. And across so many different areas, I'm sure that would be hard to understand. You've made a huge impact on me. So your bookshelf's obviously a lot larger than mine. I'm sure that has something to do with experience. But I actually have a closet with shelves that are dedicated to my books. These are just people who either been on the show or have been most relevant recently. But you've got a couple on that shelf, and this one was definitely added to it. So I want to say to everybody, appreciate you coming and listening in. We have, so I have the book, but I also got the audio book because there's a there's a lot of time that I have. Like when I'm sitting here and I have the baby, I can't just break out the highlighters and sit around because 2 minutes later I'm gonna have to sit it down. So I got the audio book, and I gotta say, I wish you and Heiser and others would read your audiobooks because you're almost disappointed because we like listening to you guys. And so when we listen to the audiobook, we're like, oh, come on. But either way, thanks for being here, John, and hope to have you back soon to talk about the lost world of Adam and Eve. Thanks, everybody, for being here.
Great to be here, William. Thanks for the conversation, and thank everybody that was listening and giving questions.
Thank you.